Everyone, good morning. My name is Andrea, and I am very excited to introduce somebody whose work uncovering state violence in the Mediterranean Sea has been very influential to my recent thinking, Christina Varvia. An architect by training, Christina Varvia's body of work has centered around the challenging of boundaries and the violence that they produce. She's a research fellow at Forensic Architecture, where she formerly served as deputy director and lead researcher. She's also a lecturer in research architecture at Goldsmiths University of London. And currently, Christina is also pursuing a PhD at Urhouse University, where she studies biopolitics and the imaging of the human body. Her recent work challenges the conceptual separation of humans from their environment, noting that this boundary making serves to obscure the myriad forms that violence can take, including at the molecular scale. Building on thinkers like Judith Butler, Rob Nixon, Gilles Deleuze, and Felix Guattari, she argues that seeing humans as porous, as enmeshed with their environments and with others, is crucial to contesting the individualism that has naturalized certain less visible and slow-moving kinds of harm. Christina's troubling of borders at every scale, from international boundaries to the very notion of a skin barrier, represents an urgent intervention in a time where we are encouraged by the powerful to see difference before unity. And please help me in welcoming Christina.
Thank you, Andrea, and Barati, and Rhiannon, and Brianna, and everyone who's helped to organize this conference. Can you hear me? Is it loud? Yeah, okay. It's been so far incredibly nourishing, and I will try to kind of add to the ongoing discussions. It's been incredible to be with such good company and to follow up from Layal. I hope I can, although I'm not talking on Palestine on this talk, I hope we can have a few reverberations. And I wanted to just start by saying that my talk will be in two parts. It's a little bit counterintuitive, so bear with me. The first part, I will be presenting a case, an investigation that we've done with forensic architecture on a shipwreck case. And then towards the second part, I will kind of try to tease out some of what Andrea just kind of suggested, some of the more philosophical thinking that I've been doing through my PhD, to try to think about how different feminist notions of a human body as an expanded body, as a material body, might help add towards the conceptual arsenal of thinking about abolition more broadly. But first, I'll start with this investigation. And a small warning, this contains images, close-up images of a shipwreck that might be difficult to watch. So if you don't feel like accessing them today, please feel free to disengage and come back in 10 minutes or so. So on the 28th of October, Amel Al-Zakut, 28th of October 2015, that is, at what they call the height of the long summer of migration, Amel Al-Zakut, who was a Syrian artist who was aiming to rejoin her partner in Germany, took the perilous trip from the coast of Turkey to the Greek island of Lesbos on a small wooden boat after she was refused her visa. She filmed her whole journey. Sorry, maybe I can do this. This will be easier. She filmed her whole journey with a waterproof camera attached to her wrist, not knowing that this would result to one of the deadliest shipwrecks of the Aegean Sea's recent history, with more than 43 people dead. Of course, the Pila shipwreck that I will briefly mention later of June 2023 has raised this death toll to more than 600 people. We met Amel in 2017, and she asked us at Forensic Architecture to work with her to understand what caused such a deadly incident in this very narrow strip of water, which was only 6.5 kilometers across Turkey and Greece. And at the time, where all eyes were looking at this crossing in this kind of really particular moment in October 2015. This footage became the basis, the footage that she captured became the basis of her own film that I heard has been screened here at Berkeley, called Purple Sea, which is an incredible piece of work, and I highly recommend you all watch it. And in my mind, it is kind of one of the most unique pieces of documentation of this type of crossing that at least I have come across, because it captures her whole journey from the smuggler's office in Istanbul until the moment of the shipwreck that you see here. This is the moment that they're falling into the water. Her friend and co-traveler was also transmitting their location to a WhatsApp group with friends and family. You can see his phone on this kind of waterproof little bag. And based on this signal, we know the exact timing and location of the shipwreck, which originally we thought Google Maps shows it to be in Turkish waters, but actually a proper mapping demonstrates that it is in fact in Greek waters, therefore European waters. So Amel asked us to look for other perspectives that would help complete hers and paint a clearer picture of what happened in the subsequent rescue operation. There was a short video and a few images from Frontex, Europe's border agency, who had a boat patrolling the border. There was this head-mounted GoPro camera that the Greek Coast Guard captain was wearing. And we also had footage from the artist Richard Moss, which you might have also kind of mentioned here at Berkeley, that this footage ended up being part of Incoming, his art piece, but it's incredible that he captured this exact shipwreck. And he was working with this military thermal camera. And it's a very lucky coincidence because it was a telescopic camera and we can really see closely from afar all of the rescue operation. And we also had footage from activists stationed on the coast of Lesbos, which is not nearly as good quality as this, as well as from journalists like Michael Konate, who jumped on some of the fishermen's boats and filmed the rescue operation. And finally, we had AIS data transmitting from commercial ships, which helped us anchor the footage to accurate locations and timings in relation to the ships that we see in the background, and to locate where the shipwreck was happening and how it was also drifting according to wind patterns, what you see here. So how the people ended up drifting towards certain direction, then being kind of rescued slowly. So we worked with this abstract and grainy footage and tried to locate it in a 3D model, as we do in forensic architecture, by observing kind of distinct features in the landscape, at the shores across, by piecing together these perspectives. And we kind of reconstructed a timeline of events and analyzed what happened in the rescue operation. It is important to note that Frontex has claimed to rescue 120 migrants, claiming this is a very successful rescue operation. This was a time that they were still boasting about rescues. But of course, as we went on to investigate, we realized that both Frontex and the European Coast Guard were incredibly ill-equipped and completely undertrained for the rescue. The people who actually had a crucial role in rescuing were the lifeguards volunteers from the NGO Proactiva Open Arms, and the Greek and Turkish local fishermen who jumped in and kind of went to help with the rescue operation. Of course, since then, both the Greek and European states have ever since accused NGOs and civilians who undertake rescue operations as they have accused them of assisting smuggling. And so in essence, they're criminalizing them and stopping all of the rescue operation. So we're in a very different time now. I will play this short video with sound. It is in Catalan. It has a bit of subtitles, but I'm not sure you'll be able to see, but I'll explain what is going on.
No se mojaban, solo alargaban un brazo, nadie fue al agua a subir a niños, no se nos ayudó nadie. Fue muy policial su actuación. Estoy seguro de que ninguno de los griegos tenía ninguna formación en primeros auxilios, cero formación en primeros auxilios.
So this is Oscar Camps, one of the rescuers, and he's explaining how the Coast Guards didn't even get wet. Their behavior was very police-like, and they didn't even know how to perform CPR. So after the rescuers had rescued people, they had to jump on the Frontex boat to do the CPR themselves. Essentially, not really be able to depend on the Coast Guard for anything. And a few days before the shipwreck, the European and Turkish authorities had published a joint action plan to restrict migration across Europe's eastern borders, which later resulted in the EU-Turkey deal that we found later on, which has led to the increasing militarization, with NGOs being more and more criminalized, and with a completely shift in policy where we see now that nature is weaponized again and again against migrants. So letting nature do the hard work, the cold, the kind of the drifting, do the dirty work of deterrence. In the meantime, the budgets for surveillance across the borders are rising. This is the segment from showing the Frontex helicopter that was on the scene. Amel was filming it and was describing how that gave her purpose, because she thought that the helicopter was filming them, but not actually doing much. I'll play this little segment with sound.
El helicóptero seguía en estacionaria en el mismo sitio y solo sé que estaba grabando, como mucho estaba grabando vídeo. Pero no hizo nada, molestar, porque el aire del vuelo en estacionario hacía que el agua saltara por todas partes.
So the description here is about how the helicopter is flying low to survey, but in that process causing high waves and making the rescue operation more and more difficult. And so the imaging practice actually of looking at the rescue operation is making the rescue itself very difficult. So I'm starting with this investigation because I'd like to think with those images and try to think, what do those images do? How do we understand the production of images in relation to the border practices? And this is my first proposition, which is a bit counterintuitive, which is to consider these images as we would architectural sections. And what do I mean by that? I will quote from a book that's called Manual of a Section. In reference to architectural drawing, the term section typically describes a cut through the body of a building perpendicular to the horizon line. A section drawing is one that draws a vertical cut transecting typically along a primary axis, an object or a building. This section reveals simultaneously its interior and exterior profiles, the interior space, and the material membrane or wall that separates interior from exterior, providing a view of the object that is not usually seen. So in a first reading, you could easily protest that photographic images do not have this capacity to cut through matter, to reveal interiors. There are also not orthographic drawings that are arranged along a perpendicular axis to the horizon line. But thinking of Amel's footage, I would say we might reconsider, because her camera plane cuts through the scene, bringing us into a visceral proximity to the horizon line, which is captured in its kind of full materiality. Far from being an orthographic perspective, the organic way that her arm moves in and out, dips the camera in and out of the water, means that it is scanning above and below the horizon line. And although we would consider the horizon line typically as an absolute straight datum line separating the sky from the sea, Amel's positionality towards that line, where most of her body is below, where her head is struggling to stay above the water, reveals the complex geometry of that line. So far from a straight line, it has all of this kind of texture. By inhabiting this threshold, Amel keeps slicing through the physical environment, producing those visual and auditory sections that capture a lot of spatial information that we are then able to use. And I would also argue, like architectural section, images are also indexical because they structure information onto a canvas according to a set of rules such as resolution, perspective, frame, contrast, saturation. So in this analogy, we would understand the plane of the photograph as the linear axis of the cut. And here, of course, Amel offers us this incredibly embodied perspective of the border, but the images she produced are by definition partial, right? They're very hard to read. So our work with the agency, our work with forensic architecture, is to try to situate them And you might notice how we do this by using a 3D model, by zooming in and out of the model, having a top-down view, and then adopting a first-person perspective as well, in order to understand what is the relationship of the section to the whole. What is that, that way, how to, let's say, undo the act of mediatization, which flattens three-dimensional space. This is the technique that we call an image complex. So in essence, our work here is to restore some of that complexity that has been flattened and to work with the gaps between the frames in order to reveal hidden relations. So 10 years later, the situation at the European borders is very different. Wet and dry borders have been militarized, creating a black box of invisibility that allows border agents to deploy violence against migrants freely, to beat, torture, and push back people who claim to seek asylum. I'm very conscious that, you know, this investigation has aged in a way. I mentioned the Pillar shipwreck of 14th of June 2023, which we worked on. I won't go into the investigation, but there more than 600 people lost their lives because, or while the Greek Coast Guard tried to tow the boat, the Adriana boat, towards Italy to kind of pull it out of the Greek search and rescue zone. In this case, the Coast Guard claimed that their state-of-the-art vessel, the Coast Guard vessel, which was equipped with automatically activated cameras, did not work properly, that there was no footage from the incident. They also confiscated survivors' phones that had footage of the towing. They sent all other commercial boats away while they're doing this operation. So essentially, they were creating this black box in order that allowed them to facilitate the expulsion. Yet it is not only invisibility that is operative in these border zones. Imaging technologies facilitate the detection and registration of bodies and vessels from a distance. And here's some of the footage from the drone, from the Frontex drone that was capturing this particular boat before the towing. In their exhibition, that's titled Kosadinos Doxiadis, Informational Modernism, the Machine at the Heart of Man. Farzin Lotfijam and Mark Wasuta documented the devices that are used to detect people to cross national lines. We also heard a bit of that description in your introduction yesterday. So they listed optical sensors, multi-sensors, infrared cameras, radars, iris scanners, fingerprint scanners, CO2 detectors, heartbeat detectors, X-ray scanners, biometric devices, UAV drones, helicopters, rigid hull boats, and satellites. So you can also imagine the economy that is supporting this whole image apparatus. Each of those devices is meant to hypervisibilize the border as an expanded spatial geography and detect material traces attempting to cross. Each of them captures human bodies on different scales, offering multiple but always partial, I would argue, images. So here I'm trying to think further about what those images do at the borders, and the work of Louis Amour and Alexandra Hall is quite useful. They call this type of detection digitized dissection, referring to the way that the piecemeal approach to visualization cuts, dissects, or what would I say even samples as if in a lab, a body. This is followed by a recomposition that projects the image of the body of a traveler as a transparent but whole object. In their analysis, they're looking at technologies such as the backscatter X-ray scanner installed in airports today, which opens the body as if anatomically before reassembling it to produce a three-dimensional image, or what Esther Leslie might call an image model in this case. So the integration of this biometric data, as well as others like fingerprints, into centralized data banks such as Eurodac and Eurosur, would allow the linking of these projected body images with other data, travel histories, race, age, and gender profiling, income data, etc. And although, of course, this integration hasn't happened yet, it hasn't been fully implemented, the EU has invested significant resources in doing so and in managing to kind of bring all of that data together. So here, I want to note how the sectioning, or what Karen Borad might call the agential cut, that happens through the imaging process, cuts away the body of a traveling person and reduces it to a few identifying classifications that allow it to be processed through the biopolitical apparatus. So this sectioning off means all sorts of ties of complexity get cut. They get flattened, they get erased, they get ignored in order to produce the illegalized subject that now has less affordances than any other citizens. So their access to employment, healthcare, education, as well as the whole kind of cultural imaginary that follows them, are determined by this apparatus of detection that has performed this categorization. And to be clear, I don't suggest that there is something inherent in the imaging in the imaging technologies that make people into racialized, illegalized subjects, but rather I would say it's the whole scoping ecology, together with the media apparatus like broadcasting stations, radio and TV shows, news channels, social media, etc. All of that, the way that this technology is used, dependent on, and often ignored, as in the case of Pilos, for example, in that shipwreck, all of that acts as a sectioning mechanism. So biopolitical governmentality, I would argue, depends on the scale of the individual subject for the management of life. This machinery that distinguishes between citizen and alien, between native and enemy, local or foreign, presupposes an individual and a separate subject. And the formation of an individual subject cut away from us, from each other, is what Achille Mbembe would call the bordering mechanism itself. So making an individual is the border, the work of the border. So, and Mbembe, of course, ties that and helps us connect that idea of borderization, the way that the separation between human to human, between human and other living beings, between human and nature, he connects that with colonialism itself. And he says, and I quote, "Colonialism had to a large extent consisted in a constant effort to separate. On one side, my living body, on the other, all those body things surrounding it, with my human flesh as the fundamental locus through which all other exterior flesh things and flesh meats exist for me." So he traces this politics of enmity that requires this fundamental separation between bodies, a denial of mutual material commons, a revoking of kin. And of course, this happens through racialization as the primary device that others and produces non-kin, dissecting the body at the borders, rendering it as a distinct object, allows the sectioning of a certain group of people outside of society. Yet, I would say, life is both materially and socially complex, and the entanglement of bodies complicates this distinction significantly. We know that labor practices create relationships of dependency. We know that food, water, and waste management link our lives in multiple ways. And most importantly, thinking also with yesterday's presentations on atmospheres, the air we breathe is shared, making our bodily separation a complete fallacy. So the enemy seen in itinerant bodies seeking asylum only works if one assumes an individualized and separated being. But how else might we think of the event of a crossing? So here is the kind of the second part, what I'm trying to propose, this kind of counterintuitive maybe proposition is I'm trying to think here how to counter this biopolitical imaginary, we can bring in different feminist notions of the human body, and particularly an expanded material body, which includes every bite of food one has ever eaten, every drop of water that has quenched our thirst, and every particle of air that we have breathed, and all of the excrement we have produced. So this kind of imaginary, the feminist imaginary that imagines the body as a field. I'm coming from architecture, so for me, it was, as a first move, is to try to spatialize the body. How much space does a body take in its lifetime? So as if taking a long exposure photograph of a human body from birth until death, this version would include, on average, 35 tons of food, 62,400 liters of water, 242 million liters of air, 3.4 tons of excrement, and 37.3 thousand liters of urine, 590 miles of hair. So this is a description of an expanded body that follows the feminist prompt that asks, why does the body have to end at the skin? In fact, if one looks closely to microscopic images of the skin as this one, it is really hard to know exactly where the body ends, as skin flakes and drifts away. According to Astrida Neymanis, the body can also be considered as a system of flows. She says these complex and shared cyclings, body to body to body, compromise our planetary hydrocommons. So sharing bodily space means living together. Feminist scholars have developed this thinking partly depending on new biological research that understands that the human organism is codependent on other symbiotic entities. This is based on the work of Lynn Margulis and others. So this microbiota, and here I'm going really into the microscopic to try to figure out what is happening through these imaging processes. These microbiota challenge the idea of an individual organism. Instead of a distinct body that is barricaded by the plasma membranes, skin barriers, and the immune system, each organism forms an ecology of codependent symbiotic organisms, a holobiont, as they call it, which challenges the whole idea of an organism as an individual. So by reading this new scientific research closely and considering all sorts of criteria like anatomical, physiological, developmental, genetical, immunological, etc., scholars like Scott Gilbert, for example, conclude that the body evolves through shared relationships with different species. So if the body as a holobiont is always a body in process, a body in a perpetual becoming or being individuated, as Simondon would call it, then what is at stake at the politics of life, or biopolitics, if you like, needs to shift. All of that needs to shift its focus into this dialectical exchange, what Gilbert calls ecological dialectics. So I'm using this definition and try to think, what does it do when we bring this definition of the human body at bordered thinking? So how could we think about borders and rights when we are working with such an expanded definition of a body? Thinking of rights of migrants through the lens of an expanded body requires us to think beyond the admittance or non-admittance of their individualized body seeking asylum across national lines. Not because the process of seeking safety and asylum is not important, far from it, but because the binary of in versus out is simply not enough to describe the precarity of itinerant life. As Martina Tazzioli and Nicolas de Genova propose, migrant life is determined by a confinement continuum that includes the multiple hybrid spaces that encompass migrant life through violent subordination. These spaces can be found before and after the crossing of national lines. They are depleted colonized lands and toxic landscapes, refugee camps and detention centers, agricultural fields and factories where illegalized people are employed below minimum wage, hospitals that deny treatment to those without papers, and schools that do not accept foreigners, quote unquote, as for example in the case of the hostile environments policy in the UK. If we think of the question of toxicity, which I think is something interesting also in this context, in the US, for example, where some of the ICE facilities and refugee camps are next to Superfund sites, these highly toxic sites that are monitored by the Environmental Protection Agency and other kind of environmental groups. It is not exactly mobility that creates this precarity, but immobility or stasis, or rather, I would say it is mobility of a different scale. The individual body may stay still while the world passes through it. The molecular flow of toxins within bodies is what constitutes this violence in this case. So a violent molecular intimacy, and again here I was thinking with Lindsay's kind of presentation yesterday on the touch. So this molecular intimacy that ends up forming bodies that is felt very closely within bodies. There's this lovely kind of rallying call from the Chicano civil rights movement in the US-Mexico border that says we did not cross the border crossed us, right? And here I'm also thinking with Mimi Scheller and her formulation of mobility justice, as she describes mobility and immobility as always connected, relational, codependent, such that we cannot think of them apart. We should always be thinking of them together, not as binary opposites, but as dynamic constellations of multiple scales. So bodies that are forced to stay put are not only forced to bear military, sexual, and economic violence, they're also forced into proximity with these multiple violent material flows by occupying lands that have been polluted and made derelict by global capitalist markets. Again, I've packed all of the quotes here, but another beautiful quote is from Etienne Balibar, who talks about the border as the border determines those who circulate capital and those whom capital circulates. So the capital sends people off to circulation, right? So the biopolitical border in this case determines the unequal allocation of bodies to materially determined land. And this is, I think, where we can think of the climate emergency and racialized borderization as they intersect in many ways. The more land will be polluted, the more it will be sacrificed for waste disposal and abandoned from care, the more bordering practices will come in to determine who will be forced to occupy that land and who can afford to escape it. And at the same time, visibility and invisibility are also operative here. So while some living conditions in the camps are very visible, things like cleanliness, fire risks, cold and wetness. There are others like toxicity that are really difficult. They escape the temporal and scalar depictions of what a border media aesthetics offers. So my argument here is that without a molecular scope towards mobility, migratory politics are insufficient. In order to counter the sectioning away of our bodies from our environments, we might have to conceive of an elaborate plural aesthetics that gives voice back to the claimants. Yet these claimants are not simply citizens as we would understand them registered through passports, numbers, and immigration histories. These claimants, I would argue, are these dynamic entities that are in the constant process of becoming through metabolizing their environments. The claimants are whole symbiotic ecologies. They form holobionts. So if the claim to asylum is made by an ecological self, and this is not exactly a legal argument, I don't think we're there yet, but more a philosophical one, then if we think about this kind of relational subject, then the possibility of accountability has to kind of widen up radically. And here I still have an open question. How could we use some of those same imaging techniques or different imaging techniques and perhaps subvert them to follow the material lines that might connect this body, for example, with flows and its flows with plant life? Or how could we use it as a basis for advocacy? And of course, at the moment, there is a whole economy of medical certificates that are all about evidencing pain as a means of claiming asylum. So I'm also cautious about how those imaging practices have been used, but I wonder whether we could use some of those aesthetics as a means of demonstrating material continuity and to evidence and show slower forms of violence that kind of escape the traditional modes of representation we have. So my kind of final provocation or way of thinking about this is kind of bringing all of that imaginary and trying to think what it does politically. So thinking of human beings as expanded bodies, I would say challenges the Westphalian tradition of sovereignty that depends on a body politic that is determined by blood-to-soil relations. Or, this is a provocation to put it more provocatively, if we were to take blood-to-soil relations seriously, how could we account for all the ways that the soil we stand on gets materially composed from elsewheres? And how do we take stock of the fact that the blood that circulates in our bodies is the result of planetary, fluvial cycles of air, water, nutrients, and toxins? Through a molecular material consideration of both land and body across time, the right-wing doctrine of blood to soil gets troubled in multiple ways. If bodies are understood expansively, then the whole notion of citizenship needs to be rethought. No longer can citizens lay claim or claim the rights to politics due to their autochthony. And here I'm thinking about autochthony with Michel Foucault, who analyzed the work of the play Ion by Euripides. And their autochthony in ancient Athens was the basis of political rights. The term's etymology is quite interesting. It points to the self that springs from the earth. So Aftos is self and Chthon is land, earth, soil, right? And it is used to indicate the connection one has to the land, often through heritage. So in this play, Ion, autochthony is what gave Athenians the full citizenship and the political power of speech, or parisia. Only the children of the land born out of Athenians were able to speak on behalf of it. However, by thinking together with feminist theory that breaks the binaries between nature and culture, body and mind, self and other, and by following material flows, in other words, by using this kind of definition of an expanded body, we can observe that, strictly speaking, bodies are not made solely from the soil that they step on. Through the different phases of agricultural revolution, the human body has been disconnected from the soil that it stands on. Here we can think through also what Marx calls the metabolic rift, the way that since we no longer produce food where we live and we no longer fertilize the ground with our own manure, the distance between agricultural production and our own consumption and material deification kind of spreads our bodily space across industrial landscapes. So imperialist and capitalist expansion has meant that the earth that constitutes our bodies is now found along global transnational trade routes. If we consider an expanded molecular body, the relationship with the land is still central. However, that relationship holds enormous complexity. Taking the question of autochthony seriously, we can trace the way that our bodies spring out of dispersed earths. In this case, I would argue autochthony is not only about heritage and legacy. In my reading, it's also about the metabolic, the daily springing from the earth that the metabolic entails. So perhaps what is necessary as a final kind of gesture is another reversal of the gaze. Instead of focusing on the ways that itinerant people seek permission to enter through national borders or not, we can focus on the ways that all our expanded bodies seek no permission to extend beyond national lines. Our bodily flows, our food and waste transgress borders daily, undermining the very idea of citizenship. Our bodies do not have any borders. Our presence is planetary. So I would say the body has, through its metabolic functions, the body has already crossed national lines, even without the act of migration. The imperialist body is constituted by colonialist production pipelines. It is energized by tea from Assam, coffee from Ethiopia, protein from cattle in Argentina. It is refreshed by tomatoes and grapes from Spain, sweetened by dates from Morocco and Palestine. In fact, I would argue the most developed countries host the most expanded bodies. Their footprints dominate the world, while the impoverished former colonies, their bodies may still have a close relationship to the land that they stand on, while supporting the global ruling class with their labor. Bodies are perhaps more autochthonous there, but it is these bodies that are made itinerant, weakened by the obligation to lactate the global north. There is very little nourishment for their own living. So our uprooting breaks the connections with the land, forcing us into a globalized system that expands our bodily space and exposes it to the wastelands of capitalism. I'm closing. If citizenship is granted following the relation of the body to the earth, then the expanded body, the body without borders, the nomadic body, the earthbound body, suggests a globalized patchy citizenship where people can lay claim, but also crucially take responsibility for the politics that have determined their own mediation. So thinking about an expanded body necessitates thinking about debordering, as the very nature of the material constitution of the body radically traverses geographies, creating intimate affiliations with land across territories and waters. In this frame, national citizenship is an archaic concept. So an expanded body, I would say, an expanded autochthony would be the first step towards considering what again Membe calls an earthly community, a we that needs to be found and worked in order to live in symbiosis. In this case, it would not be the DNA that determines a patrimonial connection to the land or what grants us a political voice, but perhaps the metabolic. So my question then, to open it up to everyone, is how could we activate this witnessing of an expanded body as an act of paresia? How could we think about it as an articulation of a right to place, as well as a responsibility, a right to the world, which I think is a more appropriate term, coming from Joseph Nevins, and a duty to protect it, a right to mobility, as well as a right to stasis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes. Can I take my privilege and ask you a question first, and then I will pass it on to Letty? Thank you so much for that. I was thinking about you showed us the backscatter millimeter scanners and then the new provision scanners. So to go back to an earlier moment of the technological capture of enfleshed bodies, there's this transformation of flesh into data double, right? Which is supposed to protect your privacy, and there's this complete sort of evisceration of the body by security technologies, so there's that piece of it that goes even beyond the kind of cross section through a body. It's the transparent subject, right? Or the transparent traveler, as they say it. So I just wanted to sort of think about that. What does it mean for the body to be fully eviscerated and turned into, say, biometric data on the one hand, in light of the cutting that it's doing between individuals and between body and environment or soil. And I loved what you were doing there. And I also wanted to invite you to maybe think with Layal's, expansion of the body across borders through sperm smuggling and the right to life, as well as perhaps Lindsay's conclusion on Arendt's poem of the palm holding unfamiliar forms or something like that. Foreign forms, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot there, but I was trying to think also through the connections. I mean, you're absolutely right. I'm very conscious that what I was trying to argue is that imaging techniques, by definition, are sectioning mechanisms, right? And it's not to say that they're good and bad. It's just to say this is what they do. And I think the trouble when they're used in order to support a bordering mechanism is that this cut becomes absolute, and this cut reduces a person, I would say reduces a person to a model of themselves, right? Reduces a person to a data model that then can feed into this process. So it is visceral, it does have material, it has a material imprint, but it's transformed into something that can feed into this kind of larger models of governmentality. And the whole point, I would say, is to recognize that this is the process, and to resist the bordering mechanism is to also try to think about how to restore that complexity or to insist on material determinacy that doesn't make it through the cut, right? So although there is a material signature in those data banks, it is not enough to describe the complexity of life. And what is necessary, in my view, is a sort of break, which of course, it's again, I was disclaiming yesterday, this is not a practical talk, but an imaginary that allows us to think about how we could reinstate that complexity, and how could that complexity challenge that whole mechanism, right? So absolutely, it's transparency, and it's hollowing out the body, basically. This process is hollowing out the body and making it into a model of itself. And then, of course, I think Layal's presentation was fantastic, and it's really interesting because what it shows is that actually the molecular can escape. And in many ways, sometimes we're talking about toxicity escaping borders, and that creates unlikely communities of resistance. In this case, there's a lot of labor in smuggling out the kind of bodily matter that allows a continuity of life, which in the beginning, it's in small quantities, but it ends up in a whole person, being created. So it's a fantastic way to, I have to think more about it, but I think it's really a wonderful way to demonstrate how the kind of artificial borderization, also there's a particular scalar operation that's happening with prisons, for example. Walls are built on the scale of the individual body, but the other scales might escape. Other ways of connecting might find a way out. And of course, my point, to go back to the touch, my point is not to say that this molecular intimacy is something that is idyllic or utopic. Far from it. It's a very contested political space, and actually it's a very violent intimacy often when we're talking about the ways that highly toxic lands are forced into proximity to certain people and end up kind of burdening the body. But it's also not the body as a whole, I would say. So Stacey Alamo has this nice way of thinking about transcorporality and says like the proletarian lung, or the liver under capitalism. So it's particular ways that this is felt, not wholly, it's not the border is not always felt on the body as a whole, but maybe parts of it are experienced intimately in different ways.
That was so brilliant, and it sparked so many thoughts. I just love this talk. So just a couple questions. One of them was the idea of the expanded body. I felt like there's this interesting synergy with political theory about the idea of the expanded demos. So like, what is the boundary of the political body? And there's this all affected interest principle. There's the idea of, everybody whose interest is affected by a particular state should be considered part of that political body, or the principle of coercion, or the idea of shared fate. And anyway, thinking if there's some synergy there. And then with the expanded autochthony section, was thinking about what you think about claims of indigenous sovereignty. And there's a suggestion of that with the colonial spaces where people have more of this connection to land, but whether or not you see synergy between this idea of expanded autochthony to Nandita Sharma's planetary commons. So, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, and I think that there's multiple people who are trying to think about an environmental public, an environmental commons, a way that a new republic needs to be formed that is basically beyond the nation state. And I think what's really interesting is, to take, in a way, what I'm trying to do is to think through a certain environmental optics that by definition do not respect national lines. So I think there's a synergy or like there's a lot to be done in thinking together abolition and environmental justice, right? Because it just doesn't respect environmental flows, and material flows do not respect those lines, or rather they are organized by those lines. They are kind of the bordering practices are organizing what bodies occupy what lands, but at the same time, through the molecular, they also escape this very strict definition. So I would say, yes, it's all about trying to think together with the question of the commons, the question of the environmental public. It's autochthony rather than indigeneity, because they have slightly different etymologies and slightly different uses. So autochthony is also used it's sometimes used for right-wing rhetorics, right? Like it's also used to claim an absolute claim to a nation state as a form of continuity. And what I'm trying to do is trouble that and to open that up. And indigeneity, I think, it's also about referring to people who've already been colonized. So it's a different stage, right? It's not a colonization that's about to happen. It's not. It's something that there's already a kind of an oppression and a particular way of insisting on land relations that is slightly different than the invoking of autochthony. So I'm trying to think about how. I'm a little bit playing with these right-wing doctrines that are trying to insist on a purity of land-to-body relations, and to really challenge that and say, well, actually, this is a complete fallacy that we're still holding on to somehow. But if we are to take it seriously, then you need to undo the nation state, basically.
Which gets to my question. And I know you said it's not a practical talk, but if I can ask about that, and just elaborate a little bit on that tension that you were just raising. So I saw that you're developing this really interesting, kind of like a geo-ontology of the expanded body that is revolutionary insofar as it, completely declines or refuses the attempts of borderization that states will bring to it to try to control the body, which is dominant and rampant and hegemonic these days. But toward the end of your talk, you're making an appeal to rights, to the language of rights, like demanding a right for citizenship or right to global citizenship or whatever it may be. And we know that a critique of rights are problematic because they make an appeal to the state. To have a right, you need a state that will enforce a right, that will protect rights. And that's, in our world, that's the state these days. And we know that the state is completely incentivized and invested in borderization in all sorts of ways. So could you talk a little bit about how the revolutionary claim to this expanded body ends up with making a claim or a demand for rights, but that implicitly reinforces a state logic of borderization?
Yeah, I think you're very sharp in pointing that out. It's that's not what I'm meant to do. The way I was using the right to the world as Joseph Nevins is kind of formulating it, which is beyond the legal right. It's basically the right to move, or a claim towards. It's taking the right to life beyond the legal context and trying to articulate. Try to articulate the way that we must imagine a world without the bordering mechanism that confines us into a place. So it's not. It's perhaps I'm using the wrong word, but I think I'm using rights as a more open, in a more open way than the legalistic way. I'm using it as a claim towards not just something that we are owed, but something that we have responsibility towards. So I think the responsibility, it's both the right to the world and a duty to protect it. It's both the ability to be able to kind of claim a material intimacy and a material relation as a means of reinforcing the fact that there is kinship. So perhaps what I should have done is to talk about more the way that what I'm trying to argue is that this idea of the expanded body ends up challenging the way that nations distribute rights, and instead say there is lines of kinship that we must follow in order to really practice a politics of both responsibility and a politics of thinking about relationality in real terms. So maybe it's my linguistic. It's a language. I don't think I use the language of the right as within that's imaginary. I should have used a different word maybe, but I'm thinking about it more expansively, and especially coming from Joseph Nevins, who is absolutely critiquing the way that the nation state has failed basically to protect stateless people, etc., etc. So, yeah, I think it's a very good question to ask in this space, and should have got it.
Thank you so much.